DIY Huntress. What is made entirely out of scrap wood and only took 1 day to build? This guy. Today I'm going to show you how I made this scrap wood wall organizer in 1 day, and I'm really excited about it, so let's get started. I've been working on some pretty big projects on my channel recently, which means that my scrap wood pile is also getting pretty big. And while I'm usually pretty proud of my scrap wood hoarding addiction, things are officially getting out of control, and it was time to start tackling this pile and building something out of what I had on hand. And since my full-time job has started up again, I've been looking for a fun, easy weekend project to tackle that is also super meaningful. So this was the perfect time to use some of that leftover wood that I had from the Murphy bed to create a fun wall organizer for my work from home space. To get started, I grabbed some leftover 3/4 inch plywood and sanded it down nice and smooth just to see exactly what I was working with. But as per usual, you can find the full list of materials and tools that I used for this project on my website by clicking on the link that I left below this video. Now, in starting this project, I wasn't entirely sure how big I wanted this wall organizer to be. I just knew that I wanted it to look like a giant piece of pegboard. I've seen these things all over Pinterest. A couple of my maker friends have made amazing versions of pegboard wall organizers just like this on their channels. I've linked those below for inspiration, so you can check them out as well. For my pegboard though, I knew that I wanted it to fit above my desk, so after trying out a couple of different measurements, I ended up landing on about 24 inches by 30 inches. And once I was happy, I then cut the plywood down to size using my circular saw and a track, which of course I forgot to double check that the depth of the saw was correct, which it was not, so don't do what I did. But anyway, at this point I realized it was probably so much easier to just work with this thing on the floor, so I moved the plywood to the floor and placed it on top of a piece of foam board insulation. I use this a lot when I'm cutting things on the floor. It just prevents the blade from going into my shop floor when I'm cutting. And I just finished cutting my plywood to its final size down here. It just made life so much easier. Next, it was time to figure out how to space these things, and honestly, this was the hardest part of this project. I started at 2 inches, and then that wasn't enough, and then I went to 5, and that was too much, and then I ended up deciding to make grid lines at about 3 inches each, which almost made for the perfect grid. I ended up having to cut a little bit of excess plywood off of the bottom at some point because I realized there was a little bit too much material, but all good. Essentially, I ended up starting all of the holes 3 inches from each edge and then decided to go every other line to make all of the pegs at 6 inches apart. So in terms of using what I've got, I only had 3/4 inch dowels on hand, so I used a 3/4 inch Forstner bit to just create little indentations at each mark that I wanted to drill a hole for a peg to go into. I then placed that Forstner bit in my drill and began to drill holes through the plywood to create my pegboard hole openings. And as I'm sure you can see, I actually kept that foam board insulation on the floor so that I didn't have to worry about drilling through the board and into the floor of my shop. Honestly, I was pretty impressed by how clean these holes were coming out using the Forstner bit. There was a ton of tear out on the backside of the plywood, but honestly, I'm not going to be looking at this once it's hanging up, so I didn't really mind. I was more focused on making sure that the holes in the front looked beautiful. Now, before moving on to any finishing steps, I actually wanted to do a pretty thorough sanding, and I recently got my hand on this Dremel light rotary tool as part of Home Depot's Prospective program, and its little sanding attachment was honestly perfect for getting into these little holes and just sanding away any of the excess splintering. If you don't have a Dremel, you could actually wrap a piece of sandpaper around a dowel and use that to sand the inside of these openings, but honestly, the Dremel was so fast and easy, I was able to sand all of these openings in like a couple of minutes. But once I was done being obsessive about sanding all of the little pegboard hole openings, I then moved on to doing finish sanding on the entire plywood piece, and I sanded to 220 grit. Even though the Forstner bit was the real MVP of this project, let's be real, it wasn't perfect, so there were a couple of spots where there was some tear out, and I just filled that tear out using some wood putty, allowed that to dry, and then sanded that back down all the way to 220 grit as well. So since this is going to be a wall organizer for my desk in my apartment, I really wanted it to be as functional as possible. And one thing I thought of doing was making it into a chalkboard, but I didn't want the entire thing to be a chalkboard. So instead I actually decided to add a small geometric feature where I taped off a triangle and then painted that triangle with chalkboard paint. I mean, for friends here who have been following me for a while, you know how much I love my little geometric features, so this little thing made me so happy. But to make sure that this triangle looked crisp and cute, I actually used a straight edge to pat down or push down the edges of the tape. You could use a credit card for this or whatever is equivalent. And then I applied 2 layers of chalkboard paint with a foam brush, making sure to use light layers so no paint seeped underneath the tape. Honestly, pulling back this tape was the most satisfying part of this entire project. While that paint dried, it was time to move on to the actual dowels to use as the pegs for my pegboard. So I used a 3/4 inch dowel that I had left over in my shop from a previous project, and I cut each dowel down to about 3.5 inches long. The size of the dowel is definitely going to depend on how you want your shelving to look. I wanted some skinnier shelving, so I cut some shorter dowels to accommodate that. Once those dowels were cut, I just wanted to sand them down, make them super smooth. I ended up sanding them to 220 grit, just like I did with the pegboard itself, and they looked great. Next up, it was time to work on the shelving, and in true scrapwood project form, I ended up using some of the leftover 3/4 inch plywood from the initial board that I cut up using my circular saw. I ended up making 2 shelves, one long shelf, one small shelf. Both those measurements and all the dimensions and all that good stuff is on my website if you are interested. But I didn't love the exposed plywood look for these shelves, so I ended up using some leftover edge banding from the Murphy bed project, applied it to those raw exposed edges using an iron, and then I flattened everything out just using a straight edge, trimmed them down to size, and then sanded everything nice and neatly. Fun fact of the day, I actually only had enough edge banding to cover 3 sides of these plywood shelves, and that actually worked out perfectly because the 4th side will be pressed against the pegboard anyway, and you won't even see it. I'll just pretend like it doesn't exist. By the time I was done cutting those dowels and fixing up those shelves, the plywood pegboard organizer was completely dry, and it was time to flip it over and add the picture hanging hooks to the back. In fact, I added these picture hanging hooks to every single side of this pegboard organizer, just in case I want to flip the orientation at some point. True story, it's been hanging on the wall for maybe 3 days, and I already want to hang it vertically, but that's my own problem to figure out. Honestly, overall, I'm super happy with the way this thing turned out, especially for being a one-day project and being made out of scrap wood. I mean, giant pegboards are honestly one of those projects I've been stalking on Pinterest forever, and I'm so excited to finally have one in my space. I mean, if my workshop can have a pegboard, why can't my home office? In all seriousness though, I do love revisiting smaller projects like this once in a blue moon because they're there to remind me that you don't need a ton of time to make really cool things for your space. You also don't need a gigantic budget either. You really can make such cool things out of scrapwood. In fact, I have an entire scrapwood project playlist on my channel if you're interested in seeing some more ideas. As always, I do hope you love this project as much as I do. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to my channel, click that notification bell, like this video, leave me a comment. All of your love and support is seriously so appreciated. I don't know what I would do without you guys, really. Have so many fun project ideas up my sleeve that I cannot wait to work on over the next week or so I will see you soon with another project, but until then, friends, happy DIYing.